Well, good evening, everybody. Thanks for coming to today's Civitas Institute lecture. I'm glad to see you here. And for those of us joining online, thanks for watching. I'm really delighted to be able to introduce Yuval Levin to you this evening. Yuval is the director of the Center on Social, Cultural, and Constitutional Studies at the American Enterprise Institute, where until a year and a half ago, I was his colleague for the past 6 or 7 years. And it's great to have you back in Austin, and it's always good to see my former friend and colleague. Many of you know Yuval's work. You know that he's the founder and editor of National Affairs, which is essential reading for anybody who cares about ideas in the marketplace of policy and culture and education today. And he's the author of numerous books as well, and The Fractured Republic, The Great Debate, Time to Build. These are all great texts. And tonight we're here to hear about his latest book, American Covenant. And I'm always bad with subtitles. How the Constitution Unified America and How It Could Again, I think is how it goes. And, in addition to the professional sort of bio intro, I would just say, I got to know Yuval 20 years ago when we worked in the George W. Bush White House. And that was an amazing place filled with a lot of people with a lot of integrity, and no more typified than in Yuval, who's the same person now as I knew back then, and who's done a lot to shape the way a lot of us think about really important issues today. So it's really great to have you here, Yuval, to talk about your book. And I'd like to ask you all to join me in welcoming him to UT.
Thank you very much, Ryan. I really appreciate that. As Ryan says, I've known him a long time, and so I can answer the question that a lot of you no doubt have, knowing Ryan, which is, does Ryan ever age? And the answer is no. Ryan looks younger. This is true of his wife, too. Looks younger than when I first met them more than 20 years ago, and is very frustrating for the rest of us. Thank you very much for having me here, and really it's always a pleasure to be in Austin. It's raining in Austin, which I have not experienced before. Apparently that happens, so that's nice to know too. And to get a chance to talk about a question that I think in some ways touches on a lot of the intense politics of the moment, but also raises some larger questions and challenges in contemporary American life. What I want to take up with you may seem like a strange subject in this moment. It's the idea of the American Constitution as a framework for national unity. That's really the core argument of this new book, and I think it may seem strange because, on the one hand, unity and cohesion are not really what we normally think about when we think of what the Constitution is for, at least not what we think of first, but also because we're living in an intensely divided time, and it can certainly seem like the Constitution is more of a source of that division than a solution to it. For both of those reasons, I think we tend to associate the U.S. Constitution with the problems of this moment. And there are voices both on the left and on the right who see the Constitution fundamentally now as an obstacle to a functional politics in a divided time. I think they're mistaken, and I want to suggest to you that becoming reacquainted with the American Constitution through the lens of the challenge of national unity is an essential first step toward taking on some of the biggest problems that we have now. Seeing the Constitution through that lens of cohesion and unity can help us, for one thing, see what the stakes are in our constitutional debate, what it is that we stand to gain by recovering some of the aims and forms of American constitutionalism, what we stand to lose by neglecting the Constitution, showing contempt for it, as we have too often been doing lately. I think we're used to thinking that what we stand to lose is something like the rule of law, so that the alternative to constitutionalism is authoritarianism, and there's certainly some truth to that. If we truly test the boundaries of our politics, if we genuinely turn against the system with brute force, and that's not as unimaginable as it used to be, so it is something we have to think about and be concerned about. But it's not quite the first thing that we stand to lose if we treat our Constitution with neglect and contempt, as we've been doing on all sides of our politics. The first thing we stand to lose is actually our capacity for cohesion, for accommodation, for coalition building, our capacity for unity in the face of some of our differences in America. And that's not a prospective danger. That's a present reality of 21st century American life. we have already been losing that capacity to an increasing degree in a polarized, embittered political culture. And we've been losing it in no small part because of our neglect of the Constitution, because of our contempt for it, because of our rejection of some of its core principles and its character. And to see that, I think it's worth our thinking about how the Constitution approaches the challenge of unity and cohesion. It is a challenge that was very much on the minds of the authors of the American Constitution. It's the first goal put forward in the preamble, to form a more perfect union. It's really, in some ways, the explicit subject of the first third or so of the Federalist Papers. It's an implicit subject of a lot of the rest, and it was often in different ways on the agenda of the Constitutional Convention. Obviously, unity is not the only purpose of the Constitution. The preamble goes on to list a series of very complicated other ambitious aims, and the document speaks to a lot more than cohesion, but it is a crucial purpose of it. And so the Constitution is in part an answer to the very question that we now constantly find ourselves asking: how can a vast, diverse society hold together and govern itself? Now, if that's right, if part of the purpose of the Constitution is to help us answer that question, then it would certainly suggest that our era of division is, in some respects, an era of constitutional failure. And I think it is, but it's a kind of failure that should force us to ask whether what we're witnessing is a failure of constitutional practice or a failure of constitutional design. Is it a failure of the system, or is it a failure of ours to understand what the system is for, how it's meant to structure our politics, and how we should act accordingly? And it does seem to me that the kind of constitutional failure we're living through is much more profoundly a failure of constitutional practice than any kind of failure of constitutional design. To see the Constitution through this lens of the challenge of unity could help us to grasp some very important things that we now tend to miss about it, and could also help us understand this divided moment a little better. And so let me briefly sketch out for you what seeing it that way might involve. First of all, to begin with, it would help us to see that the Constitution approaches the challenge of national cohesion with a particular idea of unity in mind. And it's not exactly the idea that we often have. When our politicians talk about unity now, and they do a lot, they often mean that we would be much more unified if people just stopped disagreeing with them. And that's true. And I can see the appeal. I think things would be great if people stopped disagreeing with me too. But I don't think it's practical to approach politics with that expectation. And the Constitution does not approach politics with that expectation. It begins from the assumption that we will disagree and that politics exists to address disagreement. James Madison puts this very bluntly in Federalist 10, for example. He says, as long as the reason of man continues fallible and he's at liberty to exercise it, different opinions will be formed, period. We should not expect a free society to ever be the scene of unanimity. But that doesn't mean that we therefore cannot be the scene of unity and that there can't be unity in American life. What it means instead is that we have to grasp that in a free society, a free and therefore diverse and often divided society, unity doesn't mean thinking alike. Unity means acting together. And acting together politically doesn't always require us to think alike in every way. If we understand politics as an arena of action, we can see that common action can be possible, even for a divided people, a people that does not agree on every question all the time. And that's not to say that Americans start out with no common foundation, no shared beliefs. Americans certainly are not strangers to each other. We have some basic principles in common, especially those that are articulated in the Declaration of Independence. We have a common history that holds us together in a lot of ways. But although the broadly shared principles that we can find in the Declaration do impose some general moral boundaries on American political life, there's enormous room for disagreement within those boundaries, even about those boundaries, and exactly what the principles of the Declaration mean, exactly what equality demands of us, exactly what our politics should look like. And political life is unavoidably organized around those disagreements, and so requires us to find ways to act together without fully resolving them. But that's a formulation that I think invites an important question. And the question is very simple. It's just how? How are we supposed to act together when we don't think alike? The United States Constitution, in a lot of ways, is an answer to that question. How are we supposed to act together when we don't think alike? A lot of what is most mysterious and frustrating to many contemporary Americans about the Constitution is a function of its being an answer to that question. And a lot of the dysfunction of our contemporary political culture is a consequence of failures of constitutional practice that stand in the way of putting the Constitution's particular kind of answer to that question into effect. That answer is not simple-minded, right? There is a simple-minded way to answer that question. How are we supposed to act together when we don't think alike? You might say, well, let's just take a vote and see what the majority wants, and that's the end of the story. But that kind of answer, which is offered by a lot of the Constitution's critics, I think actually fails to grapple with what is always the biggest challenge that confronts any democracy, which is simply the fact that although majority rule is necessary to legitimate public action, majority rule can also be a source of oppression and abuse. Majorities can abuse minorities and individuals. And our Constitution looks to help us act together when we don't think alike, while also balancing majority rule and minority and individual rights. That is not a simple task, and for that reason, ours is not a simple system of government. It looks to broaden majorities before empowering them, to restrain majorities while ultimately relying on them, and it deals with tensions like that, or even with contradictions, by looking for a kind of dynamic balance between competing pressures. Over and over, that is its strength. It doesn't resolve every question in a final way. It leaves it to us to live out a politics that tries to resolve these enduring questions. And that means that ultimately it's a system that forces us constantly to ask, how can we act together when we don't think alike? It suggests to us that what's required to do that is things like creating some spaces for competing approaches to coexist, for compelling opposing factions to bargain and negotiate and accommodate. It requires administering the government in steady and predictable ways that somehow accord with those accommodations that majorities reach. It requires enforcing the boundaries on the power of majorities, enforcing the structure of the system. It requires a citizenry that's reasonably well-formed in core Republican ideas by the very experience of acting together when we don't think alike. And looking at the parts of the Constitution through that challenge, understanding that this is what federalism is for, it's what Congress is for, it's what the presidency and the courts are for helping us find that very, very difficult to sustain balance, can help us to see how these various institutions have gone wrong, can help us to see what they're now failing to do and how they might do better. I want to walk through each of those institutions quickly just to suggest what this looks like, but obviously the book does so in more length than I would impose on you here. To start with, I do think it's worth thinking about federalism, and I think about federalism before thinking about the more familiar formal institutions, before Congress and the presidency and the courts, because it's actually essential to the kind of solution that the Constitution offered to the challenge it confronted. We tend to view federalism now through the lens of decentralization or maybe subsidiarity. And so we think of the states and the national government as kind of layered over each other. And we think federalism encourages us to emphasize the lower layers, to look to the states and localities. That's a way of thinking about federalism that is very convenient to communitarians like me. I resort to it sometimes, but it's actually not quite right. It would be better to think about federalism as describing parallel governments, not layered ones. And the imperative of unity is actually a key reason why that is. American federalism is intended in part to reduce the number and the scope of political controversies that have to be resolved uniformly at the national level in one way. Federalism itself actually emerged as a compromise at the convention between, on the one hand, partisans of a centralized national state that would govern the people directly, And on the other hand, partisans of a kind of confederation idea where only the states would govern the people directly and the national government would help resolve problems that the states confronted, something more like the United Nations. In a sense, the convention faced the question, which of these are we creating? And the answer it came up with is, we're creating both at the same time, even though they contradict each other. The national government and the state governments both govern the people directly. They govern the people directly in different domains. And the national government was assigned a few discrete domains, what we might think of now as national security and diplomacy and commerce. These seem like a short list, but commerce actually encompasses quite a lot of American life, as we've learned over time, and the federal government has some very important roles. But the rest of governing, which is most of governing, is left to the states to do directly. The framers essentially didn't decide what kind of government they were creating. They instead created something rather new, what James Madison called a compound republic, that can allow our national politics to specialize in some national challenges where you can't avoid the need to decide on one course of action, and let the state governments focus on problems that were nearer at hand in different ways. And this allows for a kind of diversity of governing approaches to coexist at the same time, even to compete, without all having to be resolved into a single national approach in a lot of areas. This has never been a simple matter, to put it mildly. In particular, of course, the decision to leave the question of slavery and of race up to the states proved to be untenable and wrong, and ultimately had to be reversed on the battlefield for the sake of both unity and justice. The 14th Amendment, in the wake of the Civil War, added the imperative to apply the law equally to all citizens, to the federal government's relatively limited set of responsibilities. That was a necessary rebalancing of federalism, and of course in practice it's taken a very long time to really work out. But with regard to many other contentious but maybe less existential kinds of questions, a separation of governing authorities offered and still can offer a practical means of allowing Americans to live with our diversity while still forging a cohesive national identity. And seen through the lens of cohesion, what matters most, I think, about federalism is this separation of governing authorities, the fact that these are parallel governments and not layered governments, and therefore they don't work together. They divide the task of governing into different domains. I think federalism has gone wrong where we have entangled the federal government and the states, as we've done quite a lot on education, on welfare, in healthcare. These are areas where federalism has become very confused and has robbed both the federal government and the states of real responsibility for governing, and has left these very important domains in a complicated and dysfunctional place. Constructive reforms of American federalism would have to untangle these parallel governments some, rather than layer them one over the other more. Now, the questions that do need to be resolved at the national level are, I think, intended first and foremost to be addressed by bargaining in Congress. And the purpose of Congress also looks a little different in light of the Constitution's emphasis on unity. Congress is really at the center of the constitutional system, for good and bad. Madison in Federalist 51 says, in Republican government, the legislative authority necessarily predominates. This wasn't entirely good news for him, but it was understood to be a fact. Republican government is representative government, and although the presidency and to some extent the courts too are ultimately accountable to the people, only Congress is really designed to be representative of the people. And Congress is, of course, the absolutely central institution for the Constitution's vision of unity too. By representing our plurality, the national legislature can allow for negotiations among the key factions that compose that plurality. This is the first and foremost way, the most important way, in which the Constitution envisions Americans acting together even when we don't think alike at the national level, by negotiating toward broadly acceptable courses of action. That is the essence of our politics. And when it works, Congress can function as an arena that allows us through contention and coalition building, sometimes even through integration, to resolve national problems by finding ways to act together when we don't think alike. Now, there's a very broadly shared sense, and I share it too, that Congress in this moment is not working. It's not hard to find agreement on the contention that Congress is dysfunctional, but I think it's really worth our while to ask ourselves, what do we mean when we say Congress is dysfunctional? What function is Congress not performing? There's not nearly as much agreement on that front as on the simple question of how Congress is functioning. The general answer to this question, I think in some ways the natural answer to this question, is that what Congress is not doing is that it's not passing big legislation on the issues that matter to the country, whatever you think those are, on our fiscal problems or on immigration or the environment or whatever matters most to you. I assure you, Congress is not working on it. That is a problem. But I think that if you think about Congress through the lens of the Constitution's intentions for it, you'd see that ultimately, under that layer of dysfunction, what Congress is not doing is it's not facilitating cross-partisan bargaining and accommodation. Now, that's also why we're not passing big bills. But the underlying purpose of Congress in our system is to allow for differences to be worked out through negotiation. And the fact that Congress isn't facilitating bargaining across party lines in our time is not only why we're not passing big legislation, it also has a lot to do with why our politics looks as divided and broken as it does in general. And the diagnosis matters, because if you think the problem with Congress is that it's just not passing big bills, then you want Congress to be more efficient. And so you want things like centralizing power in the hands of leadership. You want to get rid of the filibuster. You want to let things move faster, more effectively and efficiently. If you think Congress is not facilitating bargaining and accommodation, you actually in some ways want Congress to be less efficient. You want to force members to deal with each other. And centralizing power and leadership is a way of avoiding dealing with each other. Getting rid of the filibuster would be a way of avoiding dealing with each other. If what we need is to compel members into a politics of legislative accommodation, then we should want decentralization of power in Congress and power to be focused in the committee system instead. You should love the filibuster, as I do. It's the only reason we've had any bipartisan legislation in the last 20 years. And it's also prevented a lot of really bad ideas from all sides. It's a very important feature of just how our Congress is different from a European-style parliamentary legislature. It's different because it emphasizes coalition building above efficient policymaking. That's why it's frustrating, but it's also why it plays such an important role in the Constitution's conception of how our society can hold together. Now, the task of turning Congress's negotiated legislative frameworks into actually functional administration is the president's job. But the president's role in facilitating national cohesion often is also not quite what it's perceived to be. I think critics of the Constitution who are dissatisfied with how inefficient policymaking by bargaining and accommodation can often look to the president to be the more decisive actor, to act on the nation's behalf. And some people also insist that because the president is the only official elected by a national constituency, the president is also the figure who is most representative of the public as a whole, who sort of stands for our democracy. You actually see this argument coming from the White House now quite a bit in the president's contention with judges. But I think that it's totally at odds with how the framers understood the office of the presidency, and that it's at odds with how we should understand it too. The presidency is a unitary institution, so it can't be a venue for accommodation and bargaining. It's a locus of action intended both to execute the laws and to respond to demanding practical challenges on behalf of the country. When there's somebody who needs to be called at 3 a.m., that should be one person, not Congress, and it should be someone who understands their role as acting in the world within a set of frameworks created by legislation. But the framers generally did not view the presidency as a representative institution. The chief executive is elected to keep him accountable. But no one person could be representative of a diverse society. To imagine that a single person could hold us together by embodying our unity is to assume away our diversity and division, to suggest that we're already unified, we're just not adequately represented. That is what a lot of the Constitution's critics implicitly assume. But I think the opposite is closer to the truth. Because we're a diverse society, representing us requires a plural institution, not a unitary one. But the president does have an essential role as an administrator in advancing the cause of national cohesion in the vision of the Constitution. And he does this especially by providing a stable backdrop for our national life. Stability, consistency, predictability, what Alexander Hamilton called steady administration, forms the distinct, crucial contribution of the executive to the unity of American life. Stability is absolutely essential to social peace in a complicated society. Madison in Federalist 62 argues that precarious, changeable administration makes it impossible for people to feel secure, to make plans, to take risks, to engage with each other across lines of disagreement. And unsteadiness in government makes it impossible for people to be law-abiding citizens. Those are arguments that don't just apply to the president, but it's the president, because of his capacity for unitary action, who really bears the greatest responsibility to act steadily, to avoid sharp changes of direction, reversals of course all of a sudden, even his predecessor's course. Now, steadiness is not stasis. The president is expected to give a steady direction to American political life, even to some extent to Congress's work. The president is expected to set some general priorities, to propose some legislative measures, to veto ones that he doesn't approve of. But in doing all of that, beyond the defense of the nation, his chief purpose is to turn Congress's negotiated accommodations into steady, consistent, effective administration. The framers' emphasis on this is really unmistakable, and it stands out now because it's not at all how we think about the presidency now. Our tendency is to think about the presidency in more like a legislative way. We think the president's job is to advance a legislative agenda in line with the results of the last election. Well, that's Congress's job. And we've lost sight of the character of the nature of the steadiness and stability that's expected of the president. Modern presidents spend half their time undoing what their predecessor did and the other half doing things their successor will undo. That's what the presidency is now. It's all sharp turns and hard stops. It's all whiplash. And we have to see that this doesn't only undermine the work of steady administration, it also undermines our society's capacity for civic peace, for unity. It vastly increases the stakes of presidential elections. It encourages us to see our society as just two opposing camps arrayed against each other for control of the instruments of power. Reining all of this in, reining in the nature of the president's power, what's become the administrative state, is therefore not just about constraining government power and action. It would offer us a way to recover the capacity of our institutions to forge some of the common ground that we lack, the capacity of the presidency to secure a stable backdrop for American life. The third of the great constitutional institutions, the courts, also are essential to making greater unity possible, but again, not quite in the way that we might first imagine. The crucial service that the courts provide is actually not in the resolution of disputes. Courts do resolve disputes, that's what they do. But they're intended to resolve disputes about what the law is and not what it should be. And so they're not ultimately the proper venue for mediating among the big competing visions of the public good in our society. Those great public disputes over what the law should be need to be resolved through the work of the legislature above all, and in a very different way from how the courts resolve disputes. And what the courts then do is make sure that those negotiated frameworks of law are carried out in the right way, so that the most valuable service the courts provide to the cause of national unity is in their policing of the rules and boundaries of constitutionalism. The federal courts have enormous counter-majoritarian power, which makes them inherently dangerous in a republic. It's really crucial that that sort of power be used to guard the structure of the system, to keep elected officials focused on their proper work, to keep majorities contained within their proper spheres. That is a restrained role for the court, but also an essential restraining role for the court. It's going to matter enormously in the next few years. And playing that part properly is going to require a lot of what Alexander Hamilton in Federalist 78 called an uncommon portion of fortitude in the judges to do their duty as faithful guardians of the Constitution. I think that is exactly what is required of the modern court. I also think the contemporary Supreme Court is reasonably well placed to do exactly that. At least I hope so, and I do think so. But we're going to find out. That challenge is one we're going to confront. And this kind of assertively restrained role is really, at its essence, the role that the conservative judicial revolution of the past 2 generations has insisted that judges should play. There are certainly people on the right who are in the process of conveniently forgetting that, but we have to hope that the courts are not in that process and that they understand that their fundamental role is ultimately to police the boundaries of the system, to prevent end runs around the Constitution rather than to facilitate them. Now, of course, it has to be said, after describing in these ideal ways what the institutions are supposed to be, that end runs around the Constitution are absolutely rampant now. And the institutions of the system generally don't work quite as intended, generally don't work quite as I've described them here. I think that is in no small part because the Constitution's vision of the nature of unity in a free society has itself been controversial for a very long time. The idea that the Constitution exists to let us act together even when we don't think alike has actually never really sat easily with some of the most prominent critics of the system. And I think the deepest critiques have always been what I would call integralist objections to Madisonian pluralism. They argue that the system has to answer to one voice, one vision of the good, or else it cannot work. Woodrow Wilson was the most articulate of these kinds of critics. He argued that the framers operated with what he called a Newtonian image of government as a machine, but that in reality government is more like an organism. And that means that separating powers and setting interests off against each other doesn't really make sense. Wilson said this, I quote, "No living thing can have its organs offset against each other as checks and live. On the contrary, its life is dependent upon their quick cooperation, their ready response to the commands of instinct or intelligence, their amicable community of purpose." He saw a political society as one living thing, not an assemblage of living things in competition. And so he explicitly rejected the idea, really, that it was even possible to act together without thinking alike in politics. There are a lot of ways in which contemporary progressivism is similarly integralist too, insisting that every institution in our society, private or public, has to be engaged in the same social crusade, no exceptions, no exemptions, and implicitly that there can't be a society without a single comprehensive project. And there are now more and more people on the right who agree with that. They would substitute a different vision for that unitary vision. Maybe it's Catholic natural law or some kind of Christian legal tradition. Maybe it's just the will of a president that they particularly like. But they want that will to guide the social organism in a unitary way. They want there to be one path forward. If you take this to its logical conclusion, it would really mean, I think, that no kind of free society is even possible, because people in a free society are never going to think alike. These critics don't always go that far, and Woodrow Wilson really was only calling for a kind of incremental step in that direction that would require a different form of democracy based on a more radical ideal of majority rule. He thought that democracy required a politics in which different parties offered comprehensive policy programs, the public just selected among them on election day, and then the winning party would have essentially unlimited power to pursue its program until the public voted for somebody else. That's not crazy. That's how most democracies work. That's essentially a description of the parliamentary, the Westminster model. It's a legitimate democratic model of government, but it's geared much more to the demands of administration and accountability than to accommodation and social peace and cohesion. Wilson was not blind to the need for unity, but he was, I think, deaf to the logic of building cohesion by representing plurality. He thought that unity had to be achieved by unitary leadership, and therefore above all by the president, who alone has the national mandate to speak on behalf of the entire society. It's a kind of critique that points toward dramatically different ways of understanding each of the key institutions in our system. It has no patience for the havoc and disorder of federalism. It wants a system much more ordered by federal priorities. It wants a much more disciplined partisan Congress that answers to party leaders, that's accountable to coherent platforms. It wants to substitute orderly administration and adjudication for messy deliberation. It wants the president to stand in for the nation. And of course, our system has moved in exactly that direction for a very long time. That's happened under both parties, it has to be said. It's certainly, at its core, a kind of progressive idea. But I would say, as a practical matter, the most Wilsonian congressional leader in American history was probably my old boss, Newt Gingrich. It may turn out that the most Wilsonian president since Woodrow Wilson is going to be Donald Trump. But whatever might be said about the administrative and ideological consequences of this kind of counter-Madisonian term in American constitutional practice, we would have to acknowledge that it contributes to making us more divided. It's made our politics more partisan. It's raised the stakes and therefore the temperature of our elections. It's closed off some essential venues for deliberation and accommodation. So it's left us with fewer tools for fighting polarization and fragmentation. The Wilsonian turn in our constitutionalism is not the only reason we are more divided, obviously. But I think that it is why our Constitution stands there waiting for us to notice that it has the answers we're looking for. It's why we don't see that American constitutionalism is an answer to the question we are asking, that the Constitution was designed to address just the kind of problem that we're facing now, and that it could make a real difference on that front if we let it. Better grasping the presumptions, the ambitions of the Madisonian system could help us to see that in our divided moment, the Constitution is much less the problem than the solution, or at least that we need to let the logic of the system better inform our practice of constitutionalism. I would say very briefly, there's one last lesson that I would want to draw from the peculiar approach of the Constitution to the challenge of unity that could be very helpful to us now. And it points, again, to some of the smarter, more capable critics of the Constitution over the years. Their critiques are often arguments for a simpler majoritarianism. They suggest that our system is standing in the way of change the public wants, and so they imply that our divisions, in a way, are just illusions, that we actually are unified, but we're denied what we want by a system that's designed to frustrate us. This is what a lot of contemporary critics of the Constitution would argue. And I think there have been times in our history when something like that's been true, and the deliberate recalcitrance of the Constitution has been our key problem, when large majorities of Americans expressed a clear set of desires for an extended period of time, but were denied what they wanted by the rigidity of the system. But there have been other times when strife and discord and division in our society have been our biggest problems, when Americans were bitterly divided against each other, viewed one another more as enemies than friends, and so have been unable to form clear, durable political aspirations beyond getting rid of their opponents. I think we are plainly living in one of those latter moments now. There is no broad and durable American majority advancing a coherent agenda that is somehow obstructed by the Constitution. Simple majoritarianism would not be very useful when we don't have clear majorities. Our politics now overflows with partisan bile, and each of the major parties views the other as the country's biggest problem. Our elections are 50-50 over and over. Each party approaches the public by saying, the biggest problem we face is those other people, and if they win, it's all over. That is not a politics that is begging for simple majoritarianism. And it suggests that the challenge we face is not that we aren't expressing our broadly shared aspirations in the form of public policy. It's that we aren't forming broadly shared aspirations. That is what we need help with from our system now. We need help in finding ways to act together when we don't think alike, to build broader coalitions. That suggests that we're going to need to choose to prioritize coalition building and cohesion and the forging of trust. And to do that, we should begin by recognizing that those are among the original aims of the American Constitution, that today's intense disunity has been driven in part by our broken constitutional practice, which has undermined the means by which these aims could be pursued in our system. And to recover those means, to better pursue those aims, we're going to need to recover the understanding of unity that undergirds the Constitution, to grasp its appeal, its truth, to think about reforms of our institutions in its light, so that rather than rush to reshape our institutions in the molds of our worst contemporary civic vices, we should let the structure of our institutions teach us something about what we're doing wrong, and should think about how we might reform our institutions to better achieve the aims they put before us. It's an aspiration that I think suggests an agenda for reform, but also a particular spirit in which to approach the work. Citizens who want to see our society get stronger now should approach our institutions in a spirit of repair, informed by a sense of what's missing, what's broken, what's gone wrong, and something has, but inspired by a sense of what's good in what we have, what could serve us well about it. A spirit of repair is not, to put it mildly, is not the spirit of American politics right now. But we would do a lot better if we were closer to that spirit. This is a moment that tempts us to repudiate our inheritance, but actually requires us to renew it. We are frequently now angry at our Constitution because we sense that it's broken down. But I think if we could see that we have broken it, we could see that it needs us if it's going to serve us better. And by rising to repair it, we could enable it again to repair our society, to bring us a little closer together as it was made to do. So I think the work of healing our divisions has to begin with the American Constitution. Thank you.
Thanks, Yuval. That was terrific. We have some time for questions now, and so I've got a microphone here that we'll pass around. We just ask that you keep your questions in the form of a question with an acknowledgement of the others who are in the queue. But I'll start off with you here.
And tell me who you are, too.
Yes, and say your name.
Hello, my name is Allison Ng. I'm a fourth-year government major here at UT Austin, Civitas Institute of affiliate fellow, and leader of a small civil discourse club. So you assert that what has gone wrong is not so much the design of the Constitution, but rather our practice. And it seems perhaps we need to correct some mistaken understandings about the Constitution and how it lays out like our principles. So do you think increasing civic education is like a good start, part of the solution?
Well, yes, I certainly do. I think increasing civics education is a good way to help Americans think about the possibility that some of the problems we face could be addressed by better understanding the system we have before we think about how to go at it with a chainsaw. I also think it's just important to know this system. Being an American citizen is a complicated thing. And American citizens are not natural artifacts. They don't fall from trees. They're social achievements, and they're achieved by a society that takes citizenship seriously. So yeah, I think civics education, to the degree that it is about forming citizens both through knowledge and action to be capable of the highest office in the land. The highest office in the land is not the president, it's the citizen. And it's a demanding office. It comes with a lot of responsibility. And yeah, I think it takes some knowledge to do it well. So we would certainly be well served by more and better civics education. I think there is a kind of awakening of interest in civics now. And that's healthy. It matters how we answer that growing interest, that it's done in a way that's directed toward a kind of spirit of repair of our institutions. But, you know, it's not just about civics. I do think that we also have to think about the structure of our political culture, the nature of the institutions, the incentives that politicians face. There is room for a reform agenda. It just has to begin from a sense that what we're trying to fix is the American constitutional system. And, you know, civics education for members of Congress wouldn't be such a bad thing either. It's not just about kids.
Hi, Yuval. Philip
Phil.
Munoz. I'm visiting here for the semester at Texas. I wonder if you might put your comments at the beginning of your talk and your comments at the end of the talk together. The comments at the end of the talk about how really divided we are as a people.
Yeah.
We're a 50-50 nation. There's no silent majority out there that if only we could get all of our people, whatever our people are, together. That just seems, if I understood you right, not to exist.
Right.
Beginning of your talk was about federalism. Not too long ago, it was hard to champion federalism in polite company. Federalism, many thought was code words for states' rights, which was a code words for all sorts of nefarious racial policies. But we're further along in our growth as a nation. Perhaps, is it possible to go back to federalism now? And would there be an opening on the left to federalism now that national power, federal power is targeted at them. One other, is the left's resistance to federalism because they are being funded by the national government?
Well, okay. Let me say a few things to this. There's a lot of foul weather federalism in American politics, always. When the president is of the wrong party and your governor is of the right party, you really love federalism. And it almost doesn't matter which party is which. We respond to a circumstance in which we would rather be governed by our state government than our federal government by rediscovering federalism. Those of us who always argue for federalism confront this challenge when our party is in power at the national level. And we say, no, actually, we still shouldn't run education policy from Washington, even though I think that the people in power now in Washington might do a better job than my governor in Maryland. In fact, I'm sure they would. That the reasons for thinking about these questions as necessarily more local questions are not about the outcomes we want, but about the country we want, ultimately. And this is really something to understand about the divisions we face. American politics is very divided, but American politics is still, to an extraordinary degree, fought out between the 40-yard lines. Americans do agree about many things. We disagree intensely about some things, and those are the only things we see. That's just natural, right? It's like people say the Supreme Court is so divided, and you say back to them, well, actually there's more 9-0 decisions now than ever in the history of the court, which is true. But the 5-4 ones are the really important ones. Well, that's kind of a tautology, right? Those are the ones we notice. I think there's some truth of that sort about our politics now, too. But I do think that there's room for a recovery of the logic of federalism. Part of it would require a recovery of the story of federalism. The idea that federalism facilitated slavery is false. That is a false idea. The only reason abolitionism was possible was federalism. States' rights was the argument of the anti-slavery movement until after the Civil War, right? The South wanted national power. They controlled the national government. And federalism made it possible for there to be an abolitionist movement that could make it all the way to the middle of the 19th century. It would not have succeeded without it. I think it's important to grasp that exactly to see that federalism is not about outcomes. It is about what we think citizenship should mean. And a lot of what it ought to mean should have to do with making decisions near at hand, with people near at hand about how you want to live together. And not everything has to be answered in one big central way. There's always been the argument, well, now, you know, in modern America in 1820 or 1890 or 1930, now federalism is not going to cut it. I mean, things have just gotten so much more complicated. I think that's just exactly the wrong way to think about what federalism is a solution to. And now federalism would cut it. It would help us a lot in dealing with some of the kinds of challenges that make it impossible for our national politics to work. It would be easier for those to function and to be addressed in ways that satisfy people if we could decentralize some. I do think we would have to rethink what belongs at the national level. For example, I don't think healthcare financing is going back to the states. Just as a practical matter, I don't see how that could be possible. And we have to think in creative terms. You know, Ronald Reagan in 1982 offered the states a deal that the federal government would entirely remove itself from education and provide no more funding to the states for education, but in return would take over Medicaid entirely, would nationalize Medicaid. It was a great deal. One governor took the deal, Lamar Alexander in Tennessee. I think if we think now about what a deal like that would look like, it couldn't look like that. Medicaid's much more expensive than education now. But some ways of disentangling, of understanding how federalism could work better by being disentangled, could help us think through some very important issues that matter a lot to people where they live, and that ought to be decided more often where they live. So yeah, I think federalism could be a solution now.
Rob Coons in philosophy. I really enjoyed the talk, and I absolutely agree with you about the importance of compromise and negotiation and accommodation. But I want to focus on the dysfunctionality of the Congress, and in particular the 60-vote cloture rule in the Senate, which I don't like to call a filibuster. I think they abolished the filibuster in '75 and replaced it with this supermajority. To my mind, it's made Congress ineffective in a way that creates a vacuum that the executive branch and judicial branch have filled.
Yeah.
So I'm going to turn this into a question rather than just an objection.
No, that's a question.
So you gave a good argument, really. You gave an argument for why supermajorities encourage compromise. But if that were true, then shouldn't we go to a unanimous vote in the Senate? Wouldn't that be a great way of really encouraging a compromise? And if not, if there are good reasons against that, why don't those same reasons cut against the 60-vote supermajority as well?
I agree with part of what you say. I think the filibuster was better before 1976. And what they did at the end of '75 was create what's called dual tracking in the Senate, where you could filibuster a bill but keep doing the rest of the Senate's work. And so it reduced the cost of the filibuster, made it easy to do, and now they filibuster everything. They filibuster bills to rename a courthouse in Kansas. And there's no price paid. And so, now everything has to get 60 votes. And essentially, 60 votes is a majority in the Senate. I think that returning to single tracking would still mean that the most important bills would get filibustered. The ones that people really care about, they'd be willing to pay the cost of basically shutting down the Senate for an extended period in order to require a larger majority to pass that bill. I think that would be good, and that has been good for the Senate from the very beginning. And I think it would help us to constrain the use of the filibuster in such a way that would focus it in those areas where coalition building is most needed. But what the opponents of the filibuster generally want to do is just get rid of it and have simple majority vote. I mean, you just watch. Republicans are going to discover that this is what they want to do in like a month and a half. They did it in Trump's first term. Unfortunately, there were enough of them who didn't want to do it. I think there still will be, and they're not going to get rid of the filibuster. But the temptation there is obviously very powerful. What is it a temptation to? It's a temptation to avoid dealing with the other party. It's an expression of a desire to do it on our own. That desire is now very strong, and it's grown strong in the modern Congress. This is not a function of Trump or of the last few years. I would say at least since the beginning of the 21st century, the inclination of an incoming party, every president since Bill Clinton has had both houses of Congress in his own party's control when he was first elected, and came in and said, what can we do on our own? There were a few exceptions. George W. Bush was an exception on education. In some ways, Joe Biden tried to be an exception. But generally speaking, what we've seen is what we're seeing now, which is a party comes in. Republicans have the narrowest majority in the history of the House of Representatives now. And they've come in and said, well, obviously we have to pass this big tax bill on our own. How do we get everybody to agree? Rather than who are the 25 Democrats who could vote for a tax bill that Donald Trump would sign? That is the question, that is the logic, I think, is the problem to be solved. And the filibuster is part of the solution. It's obviously not a solution, because here we are, right? There is a filibuster. But I think we would be worse off without it on this front rather than better. But I do think, and I argue in the book, that we ought to approach the filibuster in a single-tracked way and really let it have some bite so that it doesn't happen all the time.
I very much like your thesis. I like what I've read of your book. What would incentivize Congress, the legislature, to seek unity?
Yeah.
I'm Alan Hilton. I work around the nation trying to get red and blue people to talk to one another. And I sense that the public is much more interested in coming together across distance and difference than the legislature is. So how does your book compel incentive to actually strive toward that goal?
Yeah, I think the place to start is to ask, how can it be that the public's desire is not the desire of the politicians who want their votes? Because I think you're largely right. And the answer has to do with a set of incentives that members of Congress now answer to that were intended to democratize our system, but have actually made it less representative of the public. at the heart of that is the way in which the primary is used for candidate selection by the parties. The primaries are not new. They've been used to, I mean, Texas has used them to select candidates for Congress since it became a state. But they are an exceptionally bad fit for our contemporary political culture. They're doing a poor job of selecting winning candidates, for one thing, in competitive places for both parties. Both parties regularly lose elections because they just choose awful candidates for the place they're running. And they should see that the system they're using to choose those candidates is just not well suited to choosing winning candidates. The reason is the public that turns out for the primary is not representative of even the party, let alone the broader public. About 8% of Republicans, a little more than that of Democrats, turn out to vote in primaries. And it's the people who care most about politics. And look, I'm one of those people, but let's admit, those are crazy people. They spend all their time between elections thinking about politics. And they're the ones who least want compromise and bargaining because they have very firm ideological priorities and they want purity. And so we are asking the people who least want the system to work who they want in the system. That's how we start every election cycle. Well, what do you get? You get a system full of people who don't want it to work. It doesn't have to be this way. This mode of candidate selection is not written on stone tablets, and it's not in the Constitution. The parties can rethink this. And where they have, they've seen some success. A good example recently is the Virginia governor's race in 2021, where the party was on the verge of selecting a candidate who would not have won in Virginia, a very pro-Trump Republican who would have won the primary, was on the verge of winning the primary, and would not have won. Virginia is a purple state. It's more blue than red. The party committee, this is a very undemocratic thing to do. The party committee, which is 7 people, decided to use a different mode of candidate selection after having had some primaries. They had instead a ranked choice vote in a party convention. And they ended up with Glenn Youngkin, who would never have won the primary and who won the election. There's a lesson in that for parties in competitive places, right? Now, most places are not competitive. And so the parties have to have different reasons, more nationally focused reasons for seeing in those places why they should change this. But the fact is, the party system is failing. The purpose of the parties is to form broad majorities, and they are not doing it. Neither of them has succeeded in forming a broad majority in 2 generations now, or at least 1.5. Since the late 1990s, we've had 2 minority parties at the same time in America, which is just not normally how our politics works. And it's a dynamic that makes it very hard for the parties to see through this moment, to see that they're failing. Because you just barely lose an election, and you think, well, we'll just do the same thing next time and it'll work. And it does work. I mean, literally, you know, you can have a candidate lose a presidential election and just run him again, and he wins. That obviously tells the parties to change nothing. Parties and politicians learn from losing big. And nobody feels like they've lost big in a very long time. You feel like it for a little while, you know, for a few months after the election. And then you win some congressional special election somewhere and you think, actually, we're going to be fine. Let's just not change anything. Both parties have done this for a long time. And I think it would take some political talent to see through this moment and say, you could actually win, you know, 58% of the vote in a presidential election in America. You certainly could. But it would take a willingness to frustrate your activists rather than frustrating swing voters. And neither party has been able to do that in quite some time now. So I think thinking about those incentives is one way. There are ways to think about the structure of Congress's work, the budget process, and the committee system that also could be geared towards changing some of these incentives. This is my day job, in a sense. I spend a lot of time with members of Congress trying to think about these questions. The problem is not an absence of ideas. It's a lack of will to do it. And that can only come ultimately from voter pressure. There's no other way.
Hey, Yuval, I wanted to ask you, just thinking about the thesis of your book and what you've talked about tonight. Thinking about your book and your thesis, because I suppose I'm more pessimistic than you in the sense of I see this more as a regime-level political question happening between left and right.
Yeah.
And the very meaning of what it is to be a constitutional people is what's in dispute. The grounds of reason, human nature, philosophy are all sort of playing in here. So I don't know where compromise comes in at that regard. in that regard. And something I wanted to think about is, you said political parties aren't doing well, and there's a lot of evidence for that. But we think about the moment before Donald Trump came down the escalator, the famous ride.
Yeah.
2015, that's like a high watermark of the Republican Party. Across the board, state level offices, governorships, control of the federal government and the Senate, the House. I mean, they had done really well in the age of Obama in many respects, and yet we got Donald Trump. Mm-hmm. And it raises the question, why did the Republican Party make that move when all the evidence would suggest there were more conventional alternatives that would maybe get them to what you're talking about? And my major answer is it's kind of what your colleague Matt Continetti, he says the theorist of the moment for the ride is Angelo Codevilla. Uh-huh. And Codevilla, John Marini, Charles Kessler, these guys that would argue we're always playing regime level politics for the past 30 years or so, if not more. Yeah. And it starts with Woodrow Wilson. It starts with a philosophical contest that disputes the very ground of the Constitution. And if that's so, then your institutional story becomes much more difficult. So I wonder what you think.
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. I used to work for Angelo Codevilla, and I have a lot of I worked for him as a college student, as a research assistant, and learned a ton from him. But I do disagree with the view that he advanced, and that a number of the people you mentioned do, about the relationship between theory and practice in American political life. I think that the regime level ideas you point to are very important, but the people who are having a debate about that are two relatively narrow slivers of the American political elite. And that the American public is much more stable and sensible in its basic desires and sense of itself than that. And in that sense is much more amenable to Madisonianism than a lot of our elites are. Now, one thing that suggests is that the problem we face is a kind of elite public problem, which I think is true. That the American elite, a lot of the American elite, has lost sight of the character of the civilization that it wishes to run. And our politics now is about an elite public tension, or the few and the many, to an unusual degree for America. But I do nonetheless think that there is in our society very broad agreement about the premises of the Declaration of Independence, and that the people who openly reject it are a very narrow minority in American society, and that even they often can't quite openly reject it. If you read the opening essay of the 1619 Project, Nicole Hannah-Jones says that America has failed to live up to its ideals. And in a sense, it's a statement that gives away the entire game she's trying to play, because it's an acceptance of the truth of the ideals. I don't know what she really believes, but she seemed not to think that she could just say that the problem is the ideals. I think if she did say that, most Americans would disagree with that. In that sense, I am less pessimistic. I'm not an optimist. I'm a conservative. So I don't think things are just going to go great. That's silly. But I am also an American, and so I'm just hopeful. I do believe that our country has the resources to revitalize itself, as it has done before in darker times than this one, and that the strength that it needs can be found at its own foundations. They require a kind of recursion to those foundations. Now, that's not easy to do. It's not easy to do in this moment at all, but those foundations are there for us to recur to, and that's a big help. That's something that a lot of other nations don't have. It's why I think it's always been a bad idea to bet against the United States. And I find a lot of people now betting against the United States, and I just don't buy it. I don't think that we're going to follow the logic of what we now say in public to its logical conclusion. I don't think so. Now, look, I have to say, writing a book like this and giving talks like this, part of the purpose of it for me is to put myself in a place where I have to express a certain kind of strategic naivete about our country. I want people to ask me, as you do, wouldn't despair just make more sense? Look around. And I want to say, no, I don't think that's right. There's something about making a case for what you love in life in general that requires a certain kind of strategic naivete, right? You're not a cold-eyed realist about your kids or the Mets. You better not be. That's not going to work out. And this could be the year, right? It actually could be. So I think we also have to approach our country that way. We have to have a confidence in the potential for renewal, and there is reason for that confidence. It's not the most obvious outcome of where we're going right now, but I think that if we express and believe that sort of confidence, if we think it through, it can help us know what to do. And if we act on that knowledge, we really can improve things. So I'm an American. I'm just not going to give up. I know.
Okay. We've got time for one last question here.
Thank you. Thank you for your talk very much. Does Dobbs indicate we Americans share fundamental agreements about unalienable life?
Well, I don't think Dobbs resolves that question one way or another. It is a way in which we fight about what we mean by the idea that we're all created equal. I think part of what that truth does mean is embodied in the pro-life movement. For me, it is, and I very much am part of that movement. I think the argument we have about abortion in America is an argument about whether we really believe that we're all created equal. The trouble is that a lot of people who disagree with me about abortion don't think that's what they're arguing about, and have put themselves in a place where they insist the argument is about where does life begin? Is this a person? They assume, or they say they do, that we're all created equal, but by all, they don't mean a child in the womb. And I think the argument about whether we ought to mean that is a serious argument. I also think the answer is yes. But the fact of that debate doesn't seem to me to suggest a rejection of a commitment to human equality. And our country's history has actually been shaped by debates like this, about slavery, about eugenics, about abortion, arguments about whether we really mean everyone when we say all. And I think we obviously should, but it's good for our country that we have this argument. There's not an abortion debate like this in any other place, and I think it speaks well of the United States that there is one here, because we really do seem to think that if we can show that the child is a person, then we would have to treat the child as a person. Much of the rest of the world is in a worse place on that issue than we are.
Well, Yuval, thanks very much.
Thank
the
you.
Civitas Institute was born, I think, out of an authentic spirit of repair that emerged when enough people had enough common conclusions and incentives aligned to start something like this in the context of universities and higher education. And I think your argument in your book, some examples, even small ones like the primary in Virginia, give us some hope that the spirit of repair is possible in our politics, but no one's going to lead us there more than Yuval Levin. So let's thank him for being here with us here in Austin, Texas.